I'd like to ask Professor Gyimah to start us off.
Colleagues from the Brenthurst Foundation, the Olusegun Obasanjo Presidential Library, and the Afrobarometer, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, let me say that it is a huge, huge honor and privilege for me, as it is for the Afrobarometer Network, to welcome you to this event, an event to launch and discuss in a virtual format a new book, The Asian Aspiration, Why and How Africa Should Emulate Asia. Permit me to make a few odd remarks about why this is a uniquely gratifying occasion for us. First, the Afrobarometer and I share close philosophical and methodological affinity with the Brenthurst Foundation, and that is that evidence-based policy making offers the best and perhaps the only credible path to attaining Africa's economic and social transformation. We also share a common belief that researching the conditions and experiences of different countries and regions of the world, as we do in Afrobarometer surveys, covering about 36 countries in all regions of Africa, is a great way to generate insights for effective policy making in Africa. And then, of course, we do have a great deal of admiration for the Brenthurst Foundation for the sterling intellectual and analytical contributions it has been making to the good governance and economic transformation agenda of Africa. As reflected in the Foundation's previous volumes on the subject, such as Democracy Works, Rewriting Africa Politics, Rewriting Politics to Africa's Advantage, a volume which we had the great privilege of co-launching last year in Accra, and also on the sidelines of an Afrobarometer development conference in Glasgow. And finally, the very unusual time in which Africa and the rest of the world finds itself today gives us a very, very special reason to be feeling honored and privileged to be part of this book launch. This is a time when the COVID-19 pandemic has stopped the world with economies and livelihoods battered, and the health and indeed the lives of millions of people at risk. And as we all know, against a background of multiple pre-existing social and economic vulnerabilities, the management of the COVID-19 pandemic is bound to be extremely challenging for African governments. But fortunately, the work of the Brenthurst Foundation, together with its fabled affiliates and distinguished cast of experts and practitioners, just as that of the Afrobarometer, offers some of the best analytical inputs and insights available for the effective management of the COVID-19 crisis and beyond. In the case of the Afrobarometer, the findings from our around 7 surveys circa 2016-2018 across 34 countries did confirm many of these social and economic vulnerabilities that are bound to stand in the way of the management of our COVID-19 crisis. Our data also confirmed the prevalence of several factors within the domestic political environment that are likely to compound the challenges governments face and would face in managing the crisis, including widespread, though not universal, lack of trust in elected leaders and also the problem of official corruption. However, Afrobarometer findings also reveal the presence of some assets and opportunities, particularly popular acceptance of the legitimacy of state law enforcement, as well as significant trust in informal leaders that can be harnessed for the effective management of the pandemic. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the book, The Asian Aspiration, Why and How Africa Should Emulate Asia, significantly expands well beyond our continent the geographical and historical lens through which we can search for credible solutions to Africa's present economic and social development challenges. And therefore, we are highly, highly delighted to be associated with the launch of the book today. And with this, it's my honor, privilege, joy to hand the webinar to my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Greg Mills, to moderate the session going forward and wish all of us a most fruitful deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gyimah-Boadi. It's a great pleasure to, as ever, work with Afrobarometer and with your good self and with your colleagues. And let me at the outset say how much we value the relationship, but also value the work that Afrobarometer is doing. It's certainly changed the business of social science in Africa. It's given an empiricism to previously anecdotal observations, without which much of our analysis in the social sciences would be of much less value. So thank you very much for your contribution, and again your collegiality in co-hosting this event. My name is Greg Mills. I direct the Brenthurst Foundation, which is based in Johannesburg. I have at least two bosses with me today to speak on this panel. My chairman and co-author, and if, dare I mention it, friend, and in many respects mentor, President Olusegun Obasanjo, and Prime Minister Hailemariam Desalegn, both of whom are co-authors of this volume. And I'm going to be, in the course of the next hour, sharing the dialogue with them and with another guest, the former Prime Minister of Thailand, Prime Minister Abhisit, who is joining us all the way from Bangkok. It's after 8 in the evening there. Thank you very much, sir. We're delighted to have a voice from Asia to bring us back to the realities of Asia. Let me say also at the outset, what an extraordinary moment, and echoing the words of Gyimah, what an extraordinary moment this is. We are doing this by webinar, where we previously did this in Accra with you, Gyimah, and your team. We're doing this by webinar because of COVID. But one of the big lessons to take out of Asia's success over the last 60 years is the importance of using crises in a positive manner. As the backdrop behind me illustrates, the quote from Rahm Emanuel, the former chief of staff to President Obama, never let a good crisis go to waste. And that's certainly one of the very important lessons we take out of Asia, and it's a strand that runs through the book continuously. And I guess as a way to start this discussion, we should continuously think about what this crisis means for Africa, but also how we are going to use this crisis to carry out reforms that perhaps previously would have been unthinkable or unimaginable, but are now imperative and possible. So with that more positive view about the benefits of crises, let me kick off the discussion before I turn over to President Obasanjo and Prime Minister Hailemariam by telling you very briefly with why the Brenthurst Foundation got involved in writing this book. And the President and Prime Minister will have their own reasons for their involvement, and I'm going to ask them about that in a second. But this is a question that has been asked continuously of those involved in development policy over the last 60 years, which is, what can Africa learn from Asia, and why can't Africa be like Asia in terms of enjoying these extraordinary growth rates that we've seen in Asia over the last several decades? We stand on the precipice, or on the edge, of an enormous demographic change in Africa. We're going to double our population. It is projected over the next generation, going from 1.2 to 2.5 billion people in all of Africa. And so it makes the lessons from Asia that much more relevant, but also that much more imperative. Asia has successfully pulled 1 billion people out of poverty over the last 2 generations. We are going to have another 1 billion people in our societies over the next generation. We have to learn to grow our economies at sustainable rates as high as Asia has enjoyed. At the very beginning of this book, there is a great graph on page 8. I'll just hold it up for a second, if you can see it. I don't know if you can, very hard on the background. But basically it shows that in 1960, Asia and Africa, their average per capita GDP was roughly the same. It was about 30% of the average global per capita GDP. Then began a period of great divergence. Today, the average per capita GDP in Asia is roughly the same, just marginally below that of the global average. Africa's per capita GDP has halved, sub-Saharan Africa's per capita GDP has halved over the intervening 60 years to about 15% of the global average. Whereas Asia's made these extraordinary strides forward, seen on average 3-fold increase relative to global wealth, an increase in Asian wealth. Africa, unfortunately, has fallen behind. Again, that makes these lessons on the cusp of this enormous demographic change that much more important. So what can Africa learn from Asia is a question that has been asked of many of us many times. And we decided to set down in writing some of these lessons. What we decided to do was to write this book in a fashion that would
No, sir, I think Greg has a challenge. So
be accessible. So not too long is the first point about accessibilities. So there's 10 case studies of what we have seen in Asia over the last 100 with political and education reforms that we've seen after 1945. We then run through over the next 9 chapters, Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, different elements of what each of those country successes means for Africa In Taiwan, it was in spite of the politics of the time, it was about how to provide into a larger international market through becoming essentially a subcontractor nation. In Singapore, it's this lesson of having a good crisis back in 1965 and this commitment to leadership and detail. In South Korea, it's about incentivizing competitiveness. There's some bad lessons to be learned. And we point these out, particularly in the chapter on the Philippines, but also to some extent on Indonesia. In Thailand, of course, the tourism success, complemented by big investment in diversification and infrastructure, which the Prime Minister, I'm sure, will talk about, is notable. And then, of course, the big one, China, where the change in governmental system, Vietnam in 1985, China at the end of the 1970s, led to this tremendous growth period and pulling so many people out of poverty, which has really transformed the nature of not just the Chinese economy, not just Asia's economy, but of course that of the global economy as well. And the second half of the book, finally, is really about applying these lessons to Africa. We point out a number of very important features: the importance of good leadership, but strong institutions, the importance of not being a prisoner of the past, the necessity to get the basics right, macroeconomic stability, the importance of prioritization and planning and so on, the need to integrate your economies, both through businesses, but also with the global and regional economy, and then this importance, this imperative to let go, to lose control, as it were, of all economic facets, of not trying to control all economic facets, which is sometimes a tendency of the state. And I'm sure Prime Minister Hailemariam can speak about this in terms of Ethiopia's own reform agenda, the importance of letting go in order to be able ultimately to keep control, the paradox of relaxing and liberalizing in order to be able to grow and maintain social order. So with those short words of introduction, I want to ask President Obasanjo first why he participated in this book.
Greg, thank you very much. Professor Gyimah, thank you very, very much. I join Greg to appreciate you for the good work that you and your colleagues in Afrobarometer are doing. I think it would be right and for me to say, as Greg has said, that in dealing with the issue that we have to deal with, we require data. And the information and data we have got from you, Barometer, have been extremely useful. Greg, you asked me a question. I think I can say simply that I was drafted into this by you. So, but Greg, you will remember this is the third book that we are participating in, Making Africa Work was the first, which looked at the economic aspect of Africa, what had gone right, what had gone wrong, what we could have done, and what we didn't do, and what we shouldn't have done, that
I think we've lost President Obasanjo there. Are you hearing him?
No, he's not coming through. Let me check if I can get him back.
All right, let me, while we're waiting for him to come back on again, Prime Minister Hailemariam, a different version of the same question. In particular, when you view through your own development experience in Ethiopia, what did you take away? What have you taken away from that? And do you believe that there is a relevance in studying Asia for Africa?
Thank you very much, Greg. First of all, I would like also to thank the organizers, Professor Emmanuel and his team, and also the administrators. Greg, if you remember right, we had discussions in our brain trust group that following how Africa works, and of course in your previous books also on how to alleviate poverty in Africa and bring prosperity, I think we were trying to understand how the Asians has moved very fast, accelerated, inclusive, and shared growth within one generation, and what can we learn from this experience. That was the main reason why we started to think about writing a book, and ultimately the result is the Asian Aspiration book we have at our hand today. I think Ethiopia as a country, after the end of the civil war, the guerrilla fighters or the armed struggling groups, they were very active and knowledgeable about fighting as guerrilla fighters, but governing a nation is a different story. So it took 10 years in order to somehow understand how to govern a big nation like Ethiopia. And we came to learn, to start learning from the Asian experience as a party and also government in Ethiopia. And when I left office, when you shared about this issue, we have to do something about the Asian experience in our brain trust discussions. I came in very quickly, and I was very much happy because we were grappling to understand how the Asian countries has moved very fast. Asia cannot be put in one basket, as it is for Africa. We cannot put every African countries into one basket. So we used to learn from South Korea, Taiwan, and somehow from Chinese experience. But we neglected in Ethiopia to learn from the ASEAN countries. So we came to diversify and broaden as far as Africa is not one nation, and no one can somehow copy and paste from one country to the other one. We wanted to bring a broader and very in-depth analysis of the countries we have seen in our book. So I think that has given a more room for many African countries to learn from. But you know that there has been lots of travels and trips to many Asian countries. Even some of the Asian countries has warned us, because you are coming every time to our countries, you come with the same question, but you are not implementing them. Whatever you have taken, you are not doing anything about it. And you come back after 2-3 years, or maybe in 5 years, with the same question without implementing whatever you have taken in the previous years. So I think there was trips, but not much learning. So this book, I believe, will help to bridge the gap that people are trying to visit, to get information, to get data and understanding, but very little learning. So I think we have to somehow bring about, how we can learn from the experience of countries. I do not claim that this book is enough. I think they have to, this will give them a guidance. So everybody will design its own country-specific conditions, as even when Japan started its development, you know, other Asian tigers has begun, and then ASEAN countries similarly, and China recently. So I think, you know, every country can start in a different point of, you know, departure. But in any case, there is a basic thing that each one of them learn from one another, even in Asia. So I think this is why I was very happy to be part of this process. And thank you, Greg, for coordinating this thing.
Thank you. Baba, I see we've got you back again. One of the things we've learned from COVID is the importance of bandwidth. It's very hard for countries to operate in the COVID environment without bandwidth. And we've just had a first-hand experience of that. So, but perhaps you want to pick up on where you left off. And may I ask more specifically, and I want to lead into then asking Prime Minister Abhisit about this, which is from 1960 to 1980, Nigeria's per capita GDP was on average twice as much as Thailand's. Then in 1981, Thailand surpassed Nigeria, and today its GDP per capita is 3 times more than Thailand. So if I could, after you've said your words of introduction, sir, if I could ask you, is what happened? Why did Thailand, among many other Asian countries, accelerate up and ahead, and Nigeria, among many African countries, comparatively fall behind? And then I'm going to pass after you to Prime Minister Abhisit. President Obasanjo.
Yeah, I think he has to.
Let me take 4 dates, and let me take GDP that we have talked about, and growth rate, and between our 2 countries before the Prime Minister comes in. In 1979, Nigeria's GDP was 47 billion, and Thailand's GDP was 27 billion in 1979. In 1999, 20 years later, Nigeria's GDP was 59 billion. Thailand's GDP was 126 billion, more than 2 times Nigeria. 20 years earlier, it was much lower than Nigeria. In 2007, Nigeria's GDP has overtaken Thailand's GDP, just slightly. Nigeria's GDP was 275 billion, and Thailand was 262.9 billion. That was 2007. 2018, which I have a record for both countries, Nigeria was 397 billion. Thailand was 505 billion. It has again well overtaken Nigeria. Now, what had happened in these intervals? In 1979, when Nigeria was ahead of Thailand, between 1979 and 1999, when Thailand was well ahead, more than double Nigeria, and in 2007, just a space of 8 years, when Nigeria has overtaken Thailand, And then in 2018, when Thailand was again well ahead of Nigeria. I think two points have been made earlier, and those points were very well made in this book. The 2 points that have been well made are the issue of leadership and the issue of institutions. When you look at, without being immodest, I chose 1979 and 2007 because I could state categorically, clearly, and unequivocally what happened in Nigeria, because I was, it was my watch at that time. And the issue really is the issue that we have brought out very well in the book. One, to take leadership and institution, what are they doing? First, leadership, there must be integrity. And that integrity is not just personal integrity of the leader, but integrity of the government and all around the government. There must be integrity. Then there must be competence. There's no substitute for competence in government. And then I believe that any government, anywhere, can get competent people into government, into the bureaucracy, and do the right thing. Now, integrity and competence now deal with of personnel by and large, but the issue of policy, of course, is very, very important. And to have the right policy, you must do what we have done in this book. What has worked elsewhere? What is working elsewhere? What lesson can you learn from good practices? And what lesson can you even learn from bad practices? What you should not do? What should you avoid? Policy must be right. Policy must be tailored to the situation. And of course, each country has history, has culture, has other factors that differ from other countries. But the issue of policy and then continuity or consistency. Let me give one example in Nigeria. In 1979, we were going for agriculture and self-sufficiency in a few things. One of them was rice. And Prime Minister, you may not like that we are trying to be self-sufficient in rice because we used to import a lot of rice from the country. And so self-sufficiency for Nigeria will mean that Thailand rice will no longer be imported to Nigeria. And we were almost self-sufficient in 1979. I even asked the Director of Agriculture to go around the country. And he went by June or so, in the middle of our rainy season. He came back and said, look, barring any accident, we should be almost self-sufficient in rice production. Now, what we need to do now is to encourage and put a high tariff on rice importation, or in fact, ban rice importation altogether, which we did. the successor government formed a ministerial committee, not for growing rice, not for production of rice, but for importation of rice. A ministerial committee for importation of rice. When Nigeria was at the verge of being self-sufficient. And what happened? And this is a true story. Then the importation of rice became the order of the day. The presidential committee was given license for importation of rice to members of the ruling party. And one member and the ambassador, actually our permanent representative at the UN then, who comes from the same place as the member of this ruling party. The member of the ruling party went to America to import rice, and imported rice. And then after the pro forma invoice and letter of credit had been opened, he went to the suppliers of rice in America and said, increase the price by $5 million. And they did. Of course, they got paid. And our Nigerian politician, who happened to come, as I said, from the same place as the #2 Nigerian ambassador at the UN, went to New York to get his share of the additional money. And the rice exporter said, no, we took the risk, so you can't get anything. And he was asking for $2.5 million. They gave him $1 million. And he went to report to the #2 man in the Nigerian permanent representative's office in New York. And the ambassador called these people, and the people said, Mr. Ambassador, now what are you asking us to do? We took the risk. Your prince, your chief didn't take any risk. So in fact, what we have given him, he doesn't deserve. Now that is the sort of thing. Now where you have that level of corruption, pervasive corruption, along with very poor policy, then what happened to Nigeria, you can assess for yourself. Very bad policy and pervasive corruption. They were those things that made Nigeria not to go as fast as Thailand. And it's because Thailand, you are putting the Prime Minister on, and Prime Minister thought, I can do that comparison.
Thank you very much, Baba. As ever, wonderfully enriched with a story about the practice of government as opposed to the theory. To pass that question to the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister of Thailand, but with a little bit of an extra question, which is, you've had tremendous success in Thailand in tourism, a big potential comparative advantage, at least pre-COVID for Africa. And you've had tremendous success at diversification. Lots of auto sector investments, motorcycle investments. We study some of them in the book. How were you able to attract these industries into Thailand and make it such a success in terms of diversification, which remains, given our need to create jobs, an imperative for Africa? Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate today. And let me echo the two former leaders first, that we have to be very careful when we speak about either Asia or Africa, because there is a great deal of diversity within the two regions. And I would certainly support what we've just heard about the need for competence and integrity in government, both from bureaucrats and also from politicians. Now, despite the success that you've mentioned here in Thailand, we have had our share of problems. We've had we're still known for a lot of political instability. We have had a financial crisis in 1997 and so on. So I'm not going to pretend that it's all been smooth sailing or just success throughout the period. But I think what's important to learn, I think, from Thailand's case, which I think is similar to other East Asian countries, would be that there was a successful transformation from an inward-looking country, an import substitution strategy, towards export promotion and opening up to the world. And with that, you need infrastructure. With that, you need commitment so that foreign investors can be confident of the direction that you take. Now, despite what I mentioned about political instability in Thailand, there has been a remarkable continuity and almost a consensus in the way we've managed the economic development story, which is that once we've decided that it was important to open up, the management of the exchange rate, when it was necessary to devalue, and so on, and other difficult decisions were taken. Now, I think the takeoff in the 80s was also it coincided with what happened at the global level as well, where after the Plaza Accord, Thailand was able to take advantage of the need for Japanese investors to look for a new production base, and they settled in Thailand. What I would also add is that, we just heard a story about corruption, about import quotas or whatever. One of the things that opening up and allowing market forces to play a significant role helps is that you will need to discipline the people, because people in government in particular, because if you do not do things in a straightforward manner, if there is corruption, then the investors will vote with their feet. So the value of opening up is not just a question of having new markets to access, but also that it will keep some of the rather distasteful elements in government in check. And I think that's an important thing. It also means that your private sector needs to become more competitive as well. But you have to manage that, obviously, because you still need to protect some sectors to a certain extent and make sure that not the whole of your structure would be disrupted. Which then brings me to your point, Greg, which is that diversification is important. So as we move from primarily an agricultural country to having some industrial basis in some areas such as the auto industry or electronics, we were also building up our service sector, and tourism obviously was a natural candidate given Thailand's richness in cultural history and also beaches and other factors. And we'd like to think that we are very friendly and welcoming people. And we receive, guests from all over the world. So by diversifying, which is another important lesson, I think, you have some kind of insurance where when one sector is affected, or when perhaps, your export run into trouble, maybe your services sector would help. Now, with COVID, the tourism industry is going to be hit hard. And we also then have to fall back on our potential in the agricultural and also possibly the industrial sector, but also the health sector that we've built up rather successfully. So all in all, I think there is a great deal of pragmatism, the need for diversification and balance, the need for continuity in the general direction, and supported by all the things you find in textbooks about fiscal monetary disciplines, investment in infrastructure, and of course, again, good governance.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I guess one of the key questions, and you mentioned it, and it comes up in the book, and a number of the questions that I've received by email in the course of this meeting illustrate this point, is that Asia could learn from other Asian countries. In a sense, you had the prototype in Japan. Japan itself became an investor, as you mentioned, after the Plaza Accords in Thailand. And there was something to emulate. You don't necessarily have to take it wholesale, but you take bits of it, and then you have this spillover of investment effect across your region. How important were regional models for your success, or did you look outside of Asia as well in terms of your development?
Well, I think certainly we did learn a lot from each other. That helps. And I think when you learn from countries with in the same region and probably with closer cultural affinity, you tend to be more comfortable with trying to emulate some of the things that they do. So I think that certainly helps. But we also learn from mistakes and crises. So just to mention, for the 97 financial crisis, Korea and Thailand suffered, and Indonesia too. And for Thailand, that was because of the imbalance we got ourselves into in terms of financial liberalization without the discipline and the governance to support it. But then, you know, I see it in the background of in your screen, Greg. Every time a crisis happened, I think we learned too. So after the 97 crisis, I think we very much strengthened our financial sector. So the region's financial sector was largely unaffected by the Lehman crisis when it happened a decade later. And now, you know, people also say that successful management of COVID-19 is also partly due to the fact that we had to learn from the problems that we had when we faced SARS, again, over a decade ago. So you learn from each other, you learn from mistakes, you learn from crisis, and you do that better when you open up.
Thanks very much. Prime Minister Hailemariam, I have a special question for President Obasanjo in a second, looking at the questions in front of me. Ethiopia, in many respects, has followed an Asian-type development model. You yourself brought in a number of key investors from Asia into Ethiopia. I think you opened a Kaizen Institute as well in terms of continuous learning model of Japan. The big difference, however, between Asia and Africa has been this relationship between more fully fledged democratic systems in Africa and high rates of economic performance. And this is something that was covered, as Professor Gyimah-Boadi mentioned in the previous publication to this one. Do you see this as being a big difference in terms of the path that Africa is following, a more democratic one where development and democracy are more entwined than in the case of Asia? Are you muted, sir?
Yes, Greg, I think, first of all, I think we have to see whether Africa is fully democratic or not is a question that has to be addressed. But in reality, when you see the African context, we have to look into the, the reality on the ground. If you see the Asian process, most of the Asian countries, especially the Asian tigers, they did have an existential threat that the leaders of Asian countries has used to the maximum benefit to bring the nation or the people, the public at large, to canvas on a certain policy issues that they drafted for the specific country. If you look into, Korea has also its own existential threat, which I don't need to, explain here. Everybody knows it. And Taiwan from mainland China, and the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China, and communism on one hand, there is a threat from Taiwan. They have to do this thing carefully. The Kuomintang was very active in dealing with this kind of things. The islanders and the mainlanders issue was the main issue that has to be addressed. And, as the Prime Minister mentioned, Thailand has also its own existential threat issue. And the leaders, they knew a sense of urgency, created a sense of urgency, even though the context helped those governments to be autocratic. I think that autocratic government, has certain quality that has to be taken, but there are issues that we shouldn't be taking. Those governments has certain, specific qualities. I mentioned this simply because they are very much obsessed for development. As President Obasanjo said, this government, the second quality is that they do not put themselves into the pockets of the wealthy private sector. They are immune from the pockets of the private sector, and they have instituted a system where, even though it's not a democratic, as the Prime Minister of Thailand said, there is a check and balance in a democratic system. Since this is an autocratic system, there is no check and balance. So they somehow instituted a system that helps to deal with corrupt practices. But by the way, even though these government leaders are autocratic, they have some quality. They brought the best mind along themselves. They have a very strong team. And a meritocratic system was built in Taiwan, in Korea, in different other Asian countries, including in China. Everybody blames China as an autocratic country at this moment. But Chinese has a strong institutions and a meritocratic system. So I think we have to be very careful in delineating between what works in Africa, what works in Asia, but whether it is sustainable or not is a question. But in any case, that worked for them to extricate their people within a generation out of poverty. So I think that quality, we should see whether that exists in Africa or not, in addition to the conditions in Africa here. We cannot have an autocratic government in Africa because in Asia, in most cases, these are homogeneous society where the diversity issue is not so much a bigger problem. On the other hand, that the Cold War has helped them to stay as autocratic because there is support from the United States to Korea or to Taiwan, because there is, an enemy coming from the other side, the communist part of China or elsewhere, the USSR. So I think this kind of confrontation helped the Koreans, to move in an autocratic way. But now Africans they cannot do this because the global context is different. So we need to get certain good qualities of leadership from Asia, but we have to look into our specific conditions where Africa can only thrive if there is a democratic, developmental way of doing things. Otherwise, we cannot. So the qualities which I mentioned, this government, they're very much focused, very much committed, and laser beam focus is essential. But how much of our countries, how many of our countries are doing a laser focused, clearly designed policies that help the country to come out of poverty? So I believe that we have something to learn from this government. they are performance-based, result-oriented governments. You know, they do like private sector does. So I think this is also a very essential lesson we can learn. You cannot do this with existing African bureaucracy, which is so lazy and is not focused, is not meritocratic. It is, you know, very much intertwined by, you know, clannish and Clintland kind of network, a patronage network, which doesn't help the processes to move forward. So I think this is very essential. Second, we learn.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. President Obasanjo, this book is based, as you will recall, on extensive field work. It's the mark of the foundation to get out there, to look at things ourselves, to interview as many people as possible. And we had a tremendous afternoon, you will recall, I think it was afternoon, at General Giap's house with his family in Hanoi. And it struck me then, as it has on many other occasions, how important it is not to be a prisoner of your past. When I visited Vietnam in particular, but also indeed across much of Southeast Asia, and Singapore is of course testament to this as well, it's important not to be wholly captured by your past. It's very important to know from whence you come, but not to be captured by your past, because that tends to limit your future. And I think the one big lesson from me from the exchanges with General Giap's family was how they had moved on. General Giap's battles were about liberation. The family's battles were about enrichment and making money and having business opportunities. It was the next stage, as it were. They weren't fighting the old battles. Do you think, Mr. President, that we sometimes are too much prisoners of our past?
Well, I don't know. You know, when we were in Vietnam, I told you I met General Giap, and I found him a very fascinating, great man. And I don't know whether I mentioned that when we were there. One of the things he was trying to do in later life was to, in fact, write books on economics. And when I visited him under the auspices of Ford Foundation. I was on the board of Ford Foundation then, and he received me very well. And he said, "Look, can you get me a few books on economics?" And when I got back to New York, we sent him, I believe, about a dozen books on economics. Now, I believe the past should not be forgotten, because if you forget the past, you are likely to make the same mistakes that you have made in the past. But you should not be shackled by the past. And the lesson I learned from General Giap is that he told me what happened with him and the French. He told me what happened with him and the Americans, but he has left that behind him. He now talking about economics, and he even wanted to write a book on in Vietnam on economics. I think the past we shouldn't forget, but we should not be held bondage or prisoner of the past. We shouldn't. And then when even here in Africa now, people talk about the colonial past. Well, the colonial past have been gone for how many years? 1960. So colonial past is gone for going to 70 years in some parts of Africa. And why are we still holding ourselves and blaming the colonial past? I believe we should blame ourselves at this stage for whatever mistake we are making, for whatever we have done right, or for whatever we have done wrong. There was a time here we were talking about repatriation and all that. And the British High Commissioner said, look, what are you people talking about? And we said, well, look, we will ask you to pay for the slave trade, and we'll ask you to pay for colonialism. And he said, well, when we get your bill, we will send it to the Romans because we were colonized by the Romans. They will have to pay us first. And then the Romans will probably send it to the Persians. How long are we going to hold ourselves to the past? The past has come, and we must learn the right lesson from the past, but we must not be held as prisoners of the past. And I believe that those countries that have made progress, they have not allowed the past to hold them down. It's only those countries that are still holding themselves bound to the past that are shackled by the past. And
there's a load, there's a load of questions, gentlemen, which have come in. Among them, what's the next relevant book that we can look forward to in the future? I think I'm going to have to go and sit down for a while before that happens. But I think it is relevant to focus the last brief comments, if you can, on the post-COVID environment. It's sort of changed the world. The world will never be the same again in many respects. Of course, we might have to remind ourselves of that in a year's time. But at the moment, it seems like everything is changed. Prime Minister said, how will COVID change politics and economics in Thailand, do you think? You're not on yet.
I'm not so sure that it would change the politics. We still, I think, unfortunately, shackled to the recent past in terms of political conflicts. But as far as the economy is concerned, the way I see things is this: we were already under pressure to restructure ourselves even before COVID, because our country is aging very fast. So the demographics is going in the opposite direction to what we saw in the brief video that you showed at the beginning in Africa. We need to get out of what we see as a middle income trap. And we need to face up to technological disruptions. I think what COVID has done has really brought that to people's attention very abruptly, that now there is a real need for structural change. Obviously, some of the sectors, like the tourism sector, has been hit very hard. At the same time, we also see opportunities from the strength of our health sector. But all in all, it has woken us up to the need to make use of technology, adapt our ways of life, and use that, use a crisis once again to transform ourselves.
President Obasanjo, what do you think Africa should do as a consequence of COVID in terms of urging diversification, of perhaps getting a greater chunk of the global economy that we've been able to gain so far? How do we turn COVID, from your perspective, from a crisis into an opportunity?
Well, let me do a slight correction to the slogan you have behind you. Never let a good crisis go to waste. I would say never let any crisis go to waste, because there's always something good in any crisis. Having said that, I believe that the first lesson, or the first thing that COVID-19 will do for us in Africa, it will make us to take the issue of food very seriously. I believe that after COVID-19, most countries in Africa will have to find how they will be self-sufficient in essential food items, because food will be a problem. I don't believe that most countries have gone as far as they should go into food production during this year. That is the first point that I will see. The second point is the use of technology, as the Prime Minister of Thailand said. What we are doing now, Greg, you know that we were thinking that we will get together for somewhere for this launching that we are making. Now we are using Zoom, which is a new one, and I understand that Zoom is now more profitable than even those other the technological companies that have gone before. I think technology, digital, will come more and more on their own. And that then will create a problem for us. In a country like Nigeria, we have 14 million of our children that should be in school are not in school. How will they be able to take advantage of digital world? How will they be able to get involved in technology that will improve their life and improve their community and improve their nation? These will be problems that we will have to face in some of our African countries. And I believe too that now that we are talking of African continental free trade agreement, now how do we trade among ourselves in Africa to the advantage of ourselves? That will be one of the things that will come out of the COVID-19. I believe that, to my mind, all in all, COVID-19 may be a blessing in disguise if we really do not allow the crisis to go waste.
Thank you very much, Baba. Prime Minister Hailemariam, just in the last minute or two, it said that COVID is going to really accelerate reform processes in Africa. You're going to see more differentiation across Africa. We've already spoken about differentiation in Asia and indeed in Africa. We're going to see more of it depending on countries' ability to respond. How do you think Africa, in an environment where logistics is going to become more pressurized, can start to take some of those jobs from Asia as they migrate elsewhere, particularly out of China, and insert itself more fully post-COVID into global value chains?
Greg, as Africa is a very diverse continent, but in any case, every country has to use this as an opportunity. In the first place, to convince their own public at large that, the way we have been functioning is not taking us, so far to prosperity. So that we have to make our people understand quickly to go into diversification and utilize the global opportunity placed in front of Africa at this moment. For example, we have to focus on our youth, which is, we have youth bulge. It's opportunity and threat, both ways. If we use that as an opportunity, having the global environment that suits for Africa at this moment, diversifying our economy, going for value addition and production, and especially comparative advantage we have in Africa will help. So those countries who are very much dependent on the, natural resources, they should focus on productive capacity at this moment, because, you know, during the COVID, you know, the oil price has gone dramatically down and the economy has been very bad. So it creates sense of urgency to go for more diversified works. And tourism sector is one of the sectors that help. You know, Africa has so much endowment in this area, like in Thailand. We have very good people and natural resources and, you know, opportunities. So we have to grab this opportunity. Everybody who's coming out of this lockdown will go to, you know, different parts of the globe at this moment. So Africa can, you know, harness this share if we are prepared. So I think we have to somehow work very hard to diversify our economy.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. President Obasanjo, Prime Minister Hailemariam, Prime Minister Abhisit, it's been a pleasure, and of course a pleasure to work with Gyimah-Boadi and his team at Afrobarometer. And we've heard many today of many of the threads that run through this book. The importance of a meritocratic-based institution, meritocratic, less autocratic, I heard. The importance of agriculture, the importance of commercial management of parastatals, of state businesses, the driving need for performance, sometimes caused by insecurity, sometimes caused by a fear of failure, the importance of leadership, the importance of prioritization, the importance of using money wisely. Yes, Prime Minister Abhisit, you took on more debt and you certainly had investors from elsewhere, but that money was invested very wisely. But perhaps the most important lesson of all, and it came across very much in what Prime Minister Abhisit said, is if development is the art of working together, which is really what development is about. It's about pulling forces together. It's a complex business. It's also about being continuously innovative, having a process of continuous adaptation and continuous learning. And perhaps it's Japan which teaches us these lessons most of all. And at the end of the Japanese chapter in this book, it said perhaps the lesson of Japan is the lesson of Asia. And it's also the lesson of development in Africa, which is the need to learn, the need to translate, and the need to continuously adapt. So it's never over. Development is a marathon without a finishing line. And we can take one set of lessons, we can adapt some bits, we can seek out the common threads, which are very important. We can emulate some bits. There's some bits that we'll best leave alone because they're not replicable either in between countries or within regions themselves. But this necessity of learning, which this book strives to do, this necessity of translating, which I hope this book does, and then the importance of leadership, adapting and continuously doing so, and learning these lessons over and over again, is very much about the spirit in which the Asian Aspiration was written, and is being presented. And it's been a great honor to work with President Obasanjo, as ever, sir, and Prime Minister Hailemariam, and to have you with us today, Prime Minister Abhisit. I'm not sure, Gyimah, if you want to say a few words at the conclusion.
Again, just to echo your words and sentiment, that for us as Afrobarometer and for me personally, this has been a great, great joy. Even in these exchanges, more and more lessons have been learned, more knowledge has been gained, and we are all in a better place, looking forward and moving Africa towards the destination where we all want it to be, which is economic and social transformation. I just wanted to plug in one thing, that in the lessons that we've captured, I just missed a discussion of the importance of having an effective and properly enforced social contract between the governed and their governance. And I hope the COVID-19 crisis is putting this on the table for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gyimah, and thank you to you and your staff again. There will be a link available for those who want to download the book, which will be circulated after this meeting. So thank you once more. As ever, a great honor and pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Baba, and congratulations on the great book.
Thank you, everybody.